Hi, I'm Tom Merrill, and I'm the founder and CEO of Redstone. We are a research and consulting firm that focuses at the nexus of health technology, public health, and value-based healthcare. And in my remarks today, I want to make a direct connection between value-based care and the life sciences. But in order to do so, I want to share a few brief stories. My first story actually takes place in 2009 with a relatively unknown author by the name of Atul Gawande, who had just one of his articles just explode. Everyone was reading it, and the reason everyone was reading it, because it came out that President Obama, recently elected, who had made healthcare reform his #1 policy objective, had made Atul's article mandatory reading for his entire staff. And we can only speculate, but what I think was probably the reason that this article just really spoke to President Obama was that it made a really tricky issue in healthcare seem solvable. And that issue was healthcare costs, specifically rising healthcare costs. And what was the insight that Atul just really made approachable? It was the insight that healthcare spending varies widely from market to market. And I think if anyone sort of sits with this question for just a moment, two predictable questions will emerge. One is, why is there variation in healthcare? Why is it such wide variation? The second is, can we bring these outlier markets that spend a lot, more in line with markets that don't spend a ton? And Atul uses two neighboring cities in Texas to illustrate this point. One is El Paso, the other is McAllen. And they are just down the road from each other, but some interesting data about these two cities. In El Paso, the average spend for a Medicare beneficiary is $7,000 per year. Just down the road, McAllen, Texas, it's more than double that, $15,000. And moreover, McAllen, Texas has no better outcomes for the patients, right? So the question is, what's happening in McAllen, Texas? And if we're having at least similar or better outcomes in El Paso, can we bring these two cities into line? To answer these questions, we have to go to the origins of this research, and that comes from a little state called Vermont and a little college called Dartmouth. There was a research team in the 80s that was the first group of researchers that really brought this insight to light. And they did so by canvassing the state of Vermont. And they noticed that healthcare spending just within the state varied pretty widely. And they looked at the questions of causality. And they looked into the demographics. Is one market more expensive than another because there's more older folks? When they controlled for that, the answer was no. Health status, is it because one market has sicker folks? The answer was no. What about patient preferences? No. When they looked into the issue of high rates of hysterectomies, it was so obvious that women were not electing to have hysterectomies that were not necessary. So the answer on that was no. And eventually what they concluded was that the difference in healthcare spending from one market to another had to do with provider preferences, the way specific doctors carried out their work in their practices. There's an aphorism in healthcare that goes, the most expensive medical equipment is the doctor's pen. And really it comes from this idea this research. And this research gave evidence for the first time to this idea. So I'm going to finish with a third story. And it takes place in 2012. And in New York, there's a world-famous cancer center by the name of Memorial Sloan Kettering. And the physician leadership of this organization did something that was previously just unheard of. They boycotted a new cancer drug. Now, decisions to include or exclude medication happen all the time, and they happen very quietly. The reason that this particular story stands out is that this group of physician leadership decided to publicize their decision. They wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and they wanted to share their reasoning for why they wanted to boycott this drug. So the quick synopsis of this drug is that it went by the name Zaltrap. It was a cancer drug, and it extended life 1.4 months for colorectal cancer patients. And obviously 1.4 months can be very meaningful depending on where you are in life. I don't mean to minimize that, but the rub was the cost. For 1.4 months of extended life, it was $30,000 for a 3-month course of treatment. And what's more, there was already a drug on the market that did the exact same thing, but for half the price. And so for these doctors, it was a clear line. And in the op-ed, they used language like, this decision for us was a no-brainer. They also said things like, we are at an inflection point in terms of healthcare costs, and we cannot, in good conscience, make this decision for the patient. We have to protect the patient. And so what's the end of the story? The end of the story is that the drug company cut the cost of the drug in half, right? Again, the power of the pen. So let's bring this back to value-based care. The Macallan experience, the Dartmouth Atlas, the Zaltrap decision, together they all point to an additional insight, meaning in addition to healthcare variation, and that is that providers have the power to control healthcare costs. And so the question is, how do we get more Macallan, Zaltrap, less Macallan and Zaltrap, and more El Paso and Avastin. Avastin was the other drug that was half the price. And a lot of folks think that something called value-based care is one way to get us there. So in the last decade, this concept of value-based care has really entered the mainstream of healthcare policy discussions. And at its core, the model, the concept is to take payment models and harness the power of provider decision-making. And there's been a lot of experimentation in this last decade as well, mostly driven by Medicare, but also plenty of commercial players, various states, right, through their Medicaid purchasing power. And it's gone under various names, value-based payments, alternative payment models, outcomes-based payment models, but they all share the same thing, and that's shifting risk to the provider. And they've also experimented on a variety of different situations, so models that are for general populations. So the Medicare Shared Savings Program is an example of that. General Medicare beneficiaries and all their health needs. But they've also been experimenting with specialty populations, cancer patients, and also patients with end-stage renal disease. They're also experimenting with discrete episodes of care, something called bundled payments. And so there's just a lot of experimentation going on. And if we had to summarize it, we would say that the results have only been modestly positive. But what we do know is that we're learning, and we're learning a lot. So, and in fact, I can remember back in 2015, in my work as an analyst, having to diagram how one of these models was supposed to work. And now I look back on that diagram and I think, wow, the industry was so naive in their design. We've made a lot of progress, but obviously still a lot of progress to go. So wrapping up, I want to point to 3 related movements that I think are particularly relevant to the lifestyle, to the life sciences, excuse me. The first is that there will be a growing demand for comparative effectiveness data. Comparative effectiveness research refers to an understanding of the relative value of a given delivery approach, medication, or device. And we need this information at the point of care so we can make these decisions in a financially wise way for patients. The second is that, in a very related movement, is that outcomes-based contracting for therapeutics and medical devices is going to grow, but it's very much dependent on that cost, the comparative effectiveness research. And then the last is that the current movement to real-world data and real-world evidence stemming from clinical trials is going to accelerate. Right now, it's more of a realization that we need better data to really evaluate the effectiveness of a medication. But it's going to move from an exercise in scientific rigor to a real business imperative for these outcomes-based contracts to work, and especially the life sciences companies, from their end, that data has to line up with reality. But in doing so, like Memorial Sloan Kettering's cancer patients, we will all be better for it. So thank you for your time.